coercion, and sexuality in society. These are the topics for the Frankie Files. I'm Frankie Tees, your host, and I'll continue to focus on my own family story as well as news and recovery info for those who've survived, especially the adult children of cults. New each Tuesday. See FrankieFilesPodcast.com for more. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 45 of Frankie Files Podcast. I'm Frankie Tees. First Tuesday's always about coercion. This is no exception for today's insight into a long, coercive indoctrination into a cult spanning years, including a harrowing escape, as usual. We're joined by Australian investigative journalist Tim Elliott. He's got the accent and the looks to run at the top, but this guy hasn't a shallow bone in his body. We talk about his work on 12 tribes and other topics, including chilling comparisons to the film Midsommar. If you've seen that, you're going to like this. He's introducing us to a podcast he's completed recently called Inside the Tribe. It's a high-quality production of his years-long reporting on a couple who were inside in story form. He's a long-form writer, after all. There won't be any spoilers in this episode, but a caution for discussion of the crime events involving an untold story and babies in Australia. Tim Elliott is a decades-long investigative journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, whose work is cultural and social. Do check that out. And his new podcast is called Inside the Tribe, now streaming everywhere. We conquered the time zone to bring you this really concerning story about an international spiritual community who is prolific with their yellow deli and other businesses, which we'll learn about. It's just not what it seems, and he's been following them since 2007. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Tim Elliott of Sydney Morning Herald in Australia. You're listening to The Frankie Files, FrankieFilesPodcast.com. Well, today we are so happy to talk with Tim Elliott all the way from Australia. After 2 hit and misses, we got you nailed down. 17 hours time difference, no big deal. But thank you so much for being on the show, Tim.
No, thank you, Frankie. Thanks for having me. It's fantastic we could finally talk.
Well, I'm dealing with a serious journalist from Sydney Morning Herald, Tim Elliott. Let's talk about your journalism.
Yeah, I'm a senior writer with a magazine called Good Weekend, which is the Saturday magazine for the Age newspaper in Melbourne and the Sydney Morning Herald in Sydney. And we write about current affairs, politics, profiles, you name it. And we have about 1 million readers in print and online every week. So you do get quite a bit of exposure, and it's a lot of fun.
I bet. How many years have you been doing that?
Oh, God, I've been doing that now for about 15 years. I have also worked overseas doing freelance stories in Iran and Sri Lanka and all over the shop. So, so I sort of used to get about a bit. So I've got family now, so it's a little bit harder.
Okay. Yes, that's nice to hear. Now, did you have any contact with religions or cults as a young person?
No, I didn't, but I was sort of always interested in religion. I went to a school that was Church of England in Sydney. We copped a fair bit of religion there, but I never really believed. But it did still fascinate me that people who were seekers and who were, looking for the truth found themselves attracted to religion and also to fringe groups such as cults. it was something that always interested me. And when I got into journalism, I sort of pursued that a little bit.
When did cults come on your radar?
I was working for the Sydney Morning Herald in 2008, and I got a call from a man called, and I was doing some investigative pieces, and I had sort of touched on the issue of deprogrammers, people who help get people out of cults, as you would know. And I got a call from a guy called Matt Klein, an Aussie guy called Matt Klein, who said that he'd been a member of a group called the 12 Tribes in the late 1990s, and he'd almost lost his entire family to them. So his three little kids. He'd managed to get out. He managed to escape. He was in Canada. They'd sent him to Canada. He managed to get out, come back to Australia. But in the process, he lost contact with his wife. And something about his story really affected me, touched me, because I think it was because of her decision, the mother's decision to abandon her children for the cult. And that was just really sort of sad and quite powerful. And I sort of, from that moment, I just found myself more and more interested in this group called the 12 Tribes. And so I've pursued them ever since, pretty much.
Oh, my goodness. So I'm talking to the guy who knows a lot about 12 Tribes. 2008, wow.
There's a lot to learn about every group. And
we haven't introduced 12 Tribes to Frankie Files podcast, so I'm really happy to have you, because you're going to give us not only a direct story, but some of their ideology and things that you've learned along the way. Let's start with talking about the podcast. This podcast is great. Inside the tribe, you're following a couple Mark recruited and indoctrinated in the 12 Tribes.
So essentially, I came across them, Mark and Rose, through Matt. And Mark and Rose are an Australian couple, young Australian couple who had just returned from overseas. And I don't want to spoil the podcast too much. Mark and Rose had returned to Australia, Sydney, to live. They'd been overseas for a while. They were in between kind of two worlds, right? Some returning from overseas and being in Sydney, trying to find some work and hook up with some friends, make new friends, that sort of stuff. They were at a sort of open-air festival in Sydney, and Mark went, there's music playing and bands and food stalls, and it was all, beautiful and lovely. And Mark went for a walk just to check out the fair, and a woman walked up to him and said, she had long flowing hair and Sue's pants and cotton flowing loose pants, and she looked really hippie-ish. I think you need a home, to Mark. And that really struck a chord with him, because he kind of did at that time. So he's like, oh, right, okay. And she was from the 12 Tribes. He didn't know that. And that's where it all began. And they ended up spending 13 years in this group and getting, having a child in there. And basically they got sucked down into an abyss of horror and bizarre ritual. And
a lot of times, like you say, in this encounter, it's just an innocuous phrase or something to catch your attention at a very public event. Yeah. So harmless. And then you go to a social event and it looks really fun. You feel things. It's fun. It's beautiful.
They, the whole love bombing thing, they made him feel fantastic and like he'd found something that was unique and where he could fit in and belong, and where their family could grow up in sort of harmony and working with other people for each other. And to them at that stage in their lives, it was very appealing. They were quite idealistic and they went all in, much to their regret later on.
The Frankie Files. Let's talk about the ideology of 12 Tribes. It's Christian, right?
Yeah, it's a funny mix between Christianity and Judaism. When you join, you're given a new Hebrew name. It's a millennial cult. They essentially believe that they're trying to recreate the world of the Christian world as it was in the 1st century AD, after the Romans, after Christ was crucified. There was just basically a bunch of apostles and hardcore believers wandering around the world, forsaking everything and trying to do their best by each other, right? So very simple core beliefs. And so they are trying to recreate that, getting away from the outside world, all the temptations of the modern world. They don't believe in television, radio, newspapers, internet, all that sort of stuff. And they try and isolate their believers as much as possible, which is probably a very common thing with cults. They believe essentially that they are preparing for the end times, which, as you would know, is not uncommon. But what's different with them is they believe they're raising an army of 144,000 pure male children who will go out on the day of judgment and hopefully and do battle with Satan and hopefully prove triumphant.
So apocalypticism, sort of like the Mennonites and Jehovah's Witness, the world is going to end, but also raising a male army of 144,000, which is a biblical number, right? Okay.
Yeah, they believe they have to be very focused, uncompromising in their approach to raising this army of young children who will be strong and super disciplined and able to defeat the forces of evil. They exert extremely intense discipline on their children. This is one of the most controversial elements of the cult. They believe in corporal punishment, like vicious corporal punishment for any misdemeanor on the part of the children. So if the kids don't respond on the first command, if they don't do what they are told immediately and to the letter, they will be beaten with a rod. And that's to encourage total obedience and discipline in the children. So this is one of the things that's got them in trouble with authorities all around the world, including the FBI in the States, German authorities, and Australian police here. So it's a very dangerous, coercive, high control group.
You say locations around the world. How many locations?
Oh, God, it sort of shifts a bit because sometimes their communities don't work out in certain parts of the world, or they get thrown out, as they were in Germany. They were thrown out in Germany, essentially. So Argentina, Brazil, Australia, the States, Spain, lots of different countries, actually. And it's a small group, but they're everywhere, really. They've been sort of all over the place, and they're actually quite successful, and they operate quite a few businesses. They operate a deli and a cafe called sort of a franchise called the Yellow Deli. All around the world, you'll find the Yellow Deli. It's their kind of brand, which is all very cozy and comfortable and attractive and rustic when you walk in.
And the Yellow Deli is vegetarian and vegan, and if I recall, and it doesn't disclose that it's connected to 12 tribes.
Of course not.
Exactly.
So, and the funny thing is that, and they also have the common sense bakeries and cafes and all sorts of stuff around the world. And they operate soap factories, demolition crews, building construction companies, you name it. They're quite industrious. And one of the reasons they're industrious is because they get their members to work for free. So the members don't receive a wage, and they, in quotes, volunteer their labor. Even though they are, by the time they're doing that, they're not in a position to make a free decision. So, this group exerts extreme control over them. So,
now, Tim, I've seen pictures, and they live usually, and you'll have to correct me on, how it varies on location, but it seems like it's like in a wooded area.
In Australia, they live in they have a wonderful farm on the edge of Sydney called Peppercorn Creek Farm. And it's a lovely place. We've been out there. We tried to convince them to talk to us. And, this is a large place. They have sheep, goats, a little creek running through the property where they baptize their members, several buildings, outhouses, sheds, all sorts of stuff, and fields where they garden. So it's really a very successful, established area. And, it's usually on the outskirts of town, where they can buy a lot of land for relatively little amount of money. out of public view. Yeah, and this group's managed to stay off the radar, which is really fascinating. I can't, everybody I talk to is like, even in Sydney, they're like, oh yeah, we've been to that cafe because they operate their cafe in Katoomba. What happens is that I've been contacted by people who say, my God, I'm just getting a funny feeling from this group that operate this cafe. And I've heard some really disturbing things about the group. And I think you should. And then I Googled them. I discovered who they were and Googled them. And I came up with your name. And you've done a lot of writing about them. Because one of the impetuses for me to look into the group again and do the podcast was that in Sydney they had been caught burying the bodies of stillborn babies in the bush on their bush property, on their farm. It's very disturbing, and some people, when they heard about this, were shocked and saddened. So they got in touch with the police. There's an ongoing investigation into that, and so that was one of the impetuses for us to look into them again.
I'm guessing they don't encourage outside medical care.
No, they try to avoid outside medical care. For one thing, it costs money. They're not too keen on spending money.
Right.
It's part of their whole isolationist ethos, which goes back to the fact also they don't want to be they don't want to come under public scrutiny. They don't want, for example, if you went in as a woman and you were in labour and you were having big difficulties and they found out that you hadn't been looked after in your in lead up to your birth, then there might be uncomfortable questions asked of the group. And so they try to, such as, have you been feeding this woman properly? Has she been getting rest? And all that sort of stuff. They don't want to be placed under any scrutiny. So they basically avoid any medical care. And some of the kids have serious medical problems, whether they be psychiatric or dental care, all sorts of stuff around the world that we've heard of, that they don't go to the authority, don't go to medical services for. It's just, it's bizarre.
And that is one of the biggest concerns about cults in general, the kids.
And the people who pay the biggest price are usually the women and children who are more vulnerable, placed at the bottom of the ladder. I mean, in the 12 tribes, it's much like, I believe it's much from what I know of the Amish, women are very much subject to the headship of the household, which is always a male. So they are pretty much second-class citizens, and, they're treated as such.
So I see, because if the man is very special, he's going to be trained to be one of the 144,000. So everyone can support that mission.
Yeah, he's part of that mission of raising usually his own child. Either he's going to be him or his children. But yes, men are very much the exemplars of the community and have to be treated as such.
And I don't know if you've ever seen the film Midsommar.
Yes. Oh my God.
Because this, to me, is the best cult documentary out there, but it's billed as a horror film. But to me, it's everything.
It reminded me so much of a cult, and you're right. It seemed like people were treating it like some sort of psycho spiritual kind of thriller and horror movie, but in fact, yes, it pretty much exactly describes how a cult operates, doesn't it?
It to me, and I was 12 years as a young person's age 8 to 22, so it was like, to me, everyone comes in, and when you come in, you get absorbed in where can you best be used, depending on your skills, your age, your gender. Boom, you're processed in. You're listening to The Frankie Files, frankiefilespodcast.com. Now, you had close contact as an investigative journalist with Mark and Rose. How much time did you spend with Mark and Rose to get this story for the podcast?
Well, goodness me, a long time over the years. I did a feature
Yeah.
story about them in 2013 or 14, and just after they managed to get out, and they were still pretty traumatized. They hadn't really
Yeah.
processed a lot of the stuff, but they were really keen to talk because they had such a horrible time inside, and they wanted to expose this group. And after I got the message in 2021 or 20 from this woman who told me she was worried about babies being buried in the bush, I got onto Mark and Rose again, and I said, "Have you heard about this?" And then I remembered actually one of the features of the story that I'd originally done on Rose was she had a stillborn baby, and she'd had to bury it in the bush. So she'd been part of all of that. The diet there and the medical care is very poor. What they do is they're growing fantastic food, but they give most of the food, the really lovely food, to the public. They sell that at their cafes because that's their shop front, quite literally. That's the Disney shop front of the group. All lovely dolphins and rainbows. But within the group, they eat terribly, and the medical care is non-existent. So a lot of the women have experienced trouble giving birth. They give birth to children who are unhealthy, or they have stillbirths. Don't want to register those stillbirths often because, again, there would be questions asked about why there are so many stillbirths in this community. So they often just get rid of them and they bury them in the bush without registering their deaths. It's
terrific.
Terrible.
And like in the Midsommar film, remember when they pulled back the curtain to reveal the leader? A mongoloid child who had been inbred for multiple generations who'd lost his mind. And whatever he wrote or said was now the new cult law. You've spent extensive time researching this. So my next one was to focus on the leadership, because I find that they're all so crazy. They're also imbalanced, sort of like this Midsommar situation where you find out, you pull back the curtain, oh, it's just a crazy person who made up a bunch of stuff. What? You talked about the ideology. You talked about the ideology, but who are the leaders?
Okay, the group started in Chattanooga in Tennessee in 1972, and it was begun by a guy called Eugene Spriggs, who was a pretty charismatic, good-looking high school football star. Worked as in a carnival. Worked as a carnival barker. He had worked in a carpet factory, managing a carpet factory that his father worked in. He had been a school guidance counsellor, and also he'd been in the army. So he'd really been around and had a lot of life experience. He was walking down. He was also a deep Christian. He was walking down a beach in California in Santa Barbara, and he had a revelation where he believed that God was talking to him. This is in the early 70s, and told him he was destined to start a new ministry that was outside the bounds of established religion, and that answered to nobody, and that he was basically the conduit to God. So he started recruiting young kids, and he was very successful because his ministry was just held in a house in Chattanooga. It was very informal. They used to have rap nights and sit around talking and eating in a communal setting, and it was appealing to young people because it wasn't starchy, and it wasn't really the adult church they'd grown up with, say, with their parents, and so it was very attractive. And from there, he just kept on finding young people who were attracted to the message he was selling, and he kept on going. He got bigger and bigger, and as it went along, you're right, a little bit like the inbred child in that movie. The messages became more and more garbled and more indulgent, and his teachings became moving away from the teachings of God and more into his own idiosyncrasies and hang-ups, personal hang-ups about whether it be diet or child raising. And it got weirder and weirder. And basically that's how it morphed into what it is now. Now, there's, oddly enough, Eugene Spriggs, whose cult name was Yonek, Hebrew name was Yonek, he died during COVID. He got COVID and died. And at the moment, the group is in a really interesting period of change, of flux. So I think they're hard to know exactly what's going on at the moment because you don't get access. But from people we've talked to, there's a bit of a power struggle between some of the senior elders, and I believe that Bob Racine, a man called Bob Racine, is calling a lot of the shots now. He's actually currently in Australia trying to prop up the community here because I think that the death of Yonek precipitated a kind of crisis of faith among a few people in the group. And so he's traveling around and he's trying to shore up support.
So you don't see any slowdown or anything?
They go through periods. Look, they go through periods, the group, and have always done, of shrinkage, expansion, contraction, where they lose people for one reason or another. A lot of adherents drop out or they pick up more. I think it's much like any movement. It goes through periods of high popularity and then disillusionment. And so it's been going through that a bit. At the moment, I think it's hard to say, but I think with this, in this new period, I think there'll be a few people dropping out. I think there'll be a few people leaving if they can. But again, it's hard to say.
Great time to get word out.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we can encourage some people to look elsewhere.
Yeah.
Don't look up. No, look up.
Yeah.
Look up.
Look up. Look up.
Please look up. We've been waiting for you. Wow. Okay. Your extensive research is blowing my mind. With all that you've seen, and this is not specific to Yellow, to 12 tribes, but to cult thinking in general, which they display, why do you think it's so popular throughout time? Cults in general always find a place, no matter what changes we see in society. Boom, cults are there. Why?
Why? Because I think for much the same reason that mainstream religion exists, really. I mean, there's this inherent human need to belong to a larger group, to fit in, to find people who accept you and love you. And when you cults offer that big time, don't they? They really offer one of their great attractions is that they offer people a sense of belonging and community, where on the outside world those people otherwise might not have that. People are at almost everybody at one stage in their life goes through periods of vulnerability and are looking for a different way of living. And at the moment, I think that's particularly true. Anybody, if you look around, the world's not in a great place, and the world hasn't been in a great place for almost since it was created. Since humanity's been around. But this is particularly scary. I mean, the climate crisis is particularly concerning, and it's an existential crisis that appears to be largely beyond our control. So, and then there's wars, economic trouble, COVID, plagues. I mean, it's a big period in human history, right? That has a lot of people questioning their place and their sense of safety. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to the world? So at the moment, I think cults are particularly attractive for that reason.
Well, yes, I can really see what you're saying there. And also, it's funny how you started because we haven't been in a good place from its inception. Yeah, apocalypticism is an idea that was sold pre-Jesus. It was scaring everybody back then. Everyone's, the world's going to end in the year 100.
Yeah, exactly. Watch out, we're getting to 100. Yeah.
And the Mennonites even did the Great Disappointment, 1800, or I forget what year it was, but it's like when it didn't happen, they said, "Oh God," and they named it the Great Disappointment.
Really?
Do you? Yes, and you can Google that. It's the Mennonites, which the puritanical folks tend to use only. As Joseph Zimhart, one of the cult experts, says, they use revelations, and they take these quotes and they take them out of context. And I'm reading this great book called All You Wanted to Know but didn't think you could ask. De Vega Garcia are the authors, but they go through apocalypticism through time, multiple religions, and I dare say it is popular.
Why do you think it's popular? Tell me about your...
The apocalypticism?
Yeah.
I really think it's popular because it immediately trips your fear. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Okay, let's band together. It's the stupidest, simplest. Like a girl is thinking about a guy and they're in high school and they go somewhere and they have a guy they know. This guy has him come up and pretend to attack him. He goes, "I got you, honey." She's like, "Ah, you saved
Yeah.
me.
That's such a great analogy.
You scared me. Oh, you saved me." It's like,
Yeah.
first you scared me, though. Don't you want to disclose that you also scared me before you saved me? Or is this relationship going to be based on a total falsehood? Number two, in cults, total falsehood. But how do you think we can, as humans, curtail this extreme behavior? We do have a habit of wanting someone to be in charge. Okay. So then that person's head gets huge and they go excessive or extreme. And look how much I can get people to do. Right. But how you've been watching this, you've been studying this at close range on your podcast. I haven't listened to all of it, but it's totally amazing for going into detail. Nice high quality sound too, might I add. Um, so how are we as society going to curtail these extreme beliefs? Because I don't think it's just religious, it can be political too. Extremism, like you say, happens when people agree on things, and it can get extreme because then they close the group in and section everyone off. Everyone else is the enemy and we are right. Okay, you found your people, but you don't have to kill everyone else. How are we gonna how are we gonna curtail, the traffic? And even in 12 Tribe Views exposed to us just here today, malnutrition, neglect of kids, just all in the name of the dollar to keep 12 tribes going for the end times. Something's fishy there.
Something we need to continually focus on and make a priority is teaching critical thinking. So in school and just in society, and make critical thinking and the ability to think for ourselves more of a priority in public discourse. You'll see, even with what has happened with perhaps Trumpism or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. People are attracted to strong man figures who provide a sense of security and leadership, right? They make complex issues simple. The world's not like that. So we need to teach people from a young age to think critically and examine their beliefs and the beliefs of others and the answers that people are giving them. So they go, well, actually, you know what? I don't think what that leader is telling me is particularly, that doesn't really, it's a very handy, convenient answer to my problems, but really does it really ring true to me? Is it all too easy? I think the same thing goes for cults. If someone's offering you something that sounds too good to be true, or is offers you an answer that's very simple to life's complex questions, then think about it a bit more. You need to examine your beliefs and the information you're being given. whether it be by authority or by a religious group.
So if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is?
Yeah, it's like anything else. It's like the world's a really complex place, and yeah, you want to belong and you want to have friends and a sense of community, but you don't want to lose your independence or your ability, your critical faculties at the same time. So you always need to be alert to that. Question your own beliefs as well. Are they logical? Do they make sense? Do they stand up to scrutiny? I think that's a really important part too.
Said one of the very few investigative journalists who are left in our time. Thank you, Tim Elliott, for being here today.
No, thank you so much, Frankie. It's been fantastic talking to you.
You're listening to The Frankie Files, frankiefilespodcast.com.